a lot of intra-agency investment. It's not so much relying on the U.S. or Europe to invest in Asia, but now Asia is investing in Asia. So I would say that absolutely the direction is toward a consumer market that is more and more attractive, that is bigger and bigger. The companies that are being created in Asia, the innovation, there's no reason why this shouldn't continue to increase Asia, increase market share of the world's economy.
Thank you. So Wada-san, can I come to you next? Because as the chief economist at ADB, you talk about Asia economic integration all the time, and you have annual reports on this.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd like to respond in 3 ways. And number one, as a Factory Asia reviews, Asia has been growing quite fast. Latest growth rate is around 6%. And 6% growth is quite highest among the different sub-regions around the world. And more than 60% of global growth can now be explained by Asia. So Asia is definitely engine of global economy. And what's the foundation behind this success? As Carlos mentioned, not only Asia became open to global economy, but also within Asia, interconnectedness enhanced in last 4 or 5 decades. So that's the source of growth of Asia. Asia economic integration is really the key driver. Secondly, some numbers showing that more than 60% or around 60% of Asian trade is now can be explained within Asia. Also, foreign direct investment, around 65% or 55%. Asian foreign direct investment has been made within Asia, not only around the globe. Having said this, the final point I'd like to make is financial cooperation, financial integration side. Asia, because of the successful growth, now $6 trillion net savings has been generated by Asian people, developing Asian households and individuals. However, more than 80% of these net savings invested abroad, outside Asia, not necessarily within Asia. So I think having seen inter-Asia interconnectedness in terms of the trade and foreign direct investment, financial cooperation integration is still, there is a room. In that respect, I think room for Asia to nurture capital markets within Asia, especially a local currency denominated bond market. These things in medium term is necessary.
Thank you, Sawada-san. Vice Minister Qian, can I come to you next? What's your thought on this?
I'll speak in Chinese, okay?
谢谢，谢谢。
Well, Asia has had successful economic growth in the past few years, and it has been the driver for the world economic growth, especially China and India. They've got the attention from the worldwide for their economic growth. And during this economic boom, we see a growth of the middle class as well. In China, we now, according to statistics, have 300 to 400 million of middle class in China. And in India, we can also see a boom of middle class. So in the future, I can expect a huge growth of the consumption in Asia. And consumption power of Asia will be a strong pillar for world economic growth in the coming years. And the fast economic integration in Asia will also further improve this process. I saw a report which said that countries within ASEAN countries account for 30% of all the trade of those countries. And for Europe, the European countries, internally, their trade accounts for 70% of all trade related to Europe, so which shows that we still have room to go in Asia. And I hope that in the future, that figure for Asia can grow to about 60%. 60%, which will play major power for economic integration and growth in this region. Jenny, what's your view?
I think the models around the world in developed economies where there's integration are well proven, and the numbers that have been referred to, I think, illustrate the benefits of that. But we need to be realistic that in Asia there's a mix of very advanced economies, very rapidly growing economies, and then economies that are still in quite early stages of development of a number of things, their infrastructure, their confidence in their overall architecture within governments. And we should also understand how much confidence is required for full integration between respective economies. It's not only an economic question, it immediately raises sovereign questions. And so the subtleties of how do we get an integrated Asia that's confident, assured, connected, and integrated needs to convene sometimes through trade agreements, but in my observation and with the speed of technology, it may take more. And what I mean by that is I think we've got very excellent historic templates that we can refer to, but we also need to understand that to lift some of these populations to their potential, their modern banking systems in terms of e-commerce are going to be important ways in which the deregulation of some of these industries will allow small enterprises to have access to capital to flourish. Because to get the quick lift, in my opinion, that integration calls for, we need to see that technology and the speed with which the applications of technology reach across this region. We've seen the success of, within China, the far-sighted view of connecting people with telecommunications, connectivity, the concepts of connecting roads in terms of infrastructure. I think the question for integration of Asia is imperative for peace and stability and prosperity. But I think we're going to have to do trade negotiations plus X in several terms. And these are going to need inspired leaders who are going to need to think and rely on the current frameworks of WTO and other mechanisms, but also be prepared to look ahead in a way that we haven't necessarily seen as we've thought about integration frameworks and the speed with which we can achieve a sense of inclusion and avoid the risks of large economies rising and leaving others behind. Because the failure to integrate in Asia has very significant risks, in my opinion, and you see them demonstrated in North Africa and its relationship with Europe. So there are many reasons why we need to pay attention to making a success of this concept, and the timing is excellent.
Thank you. Professor Zhou, do you agree with what they have said?
Actually, yes. And from a
scholar's perspective, my research team actually did a lot of research on this topic, on Asian economic integration. In our research, we first categorized the Asian economies into 4 kinds. The first one is industrialized economies with strong innovation power. The second category is those in the process of industrialization, highly capable of manufacturing, just like China, who used to be a manufacturer for the world. The third category is abundant with natural resources, but because of the impact of world pricing system, those countries, they are cursed by their natural resources. The fourth category is, of course, those lagging behind who haven't been included in the world economic growth. They are outside of the inclusion of the globalization, actually. So we categorized the economies into 4 kinds, but they are all in the process of Asian economic integration.
Based on Asia's experience, we have come up with a lot of Asian models, including the Asian for tigers and the dragons. I think these models are characterized by the target of foreign market, and the regional market integration is not very high. From Asia's perspective, in terms of the percentage of the wealth in the world, Asia is still lagging behind. But the potential is huge because first, within the region, we need to have deeper integration, just like Mr. Chen mentioned. For instance, ASEAN compared to European Union is relatively low in terms of the integration. Therefore, the regional integration need to be connected with out of the region integration, but it should avoid the impact from foreign countries. For instance, the trade war between China and America will not only affect the industry in China, but also Japan and Korea and Thailand. Thank you.
I want to pick up on what Professor Zhao said, which is really the elephant in the room. So I want to talk about the global trading tension. Now, U.S. challenge to the current global trading order is quite clear. And many argue that the current global trading system has become very dysfunctional. Now, Trump is not really the problem himself, but rather he's the symptom and the result of the problem. So how do you see that we can improve the current trading system or create a new one? What platforms from what you see would provide that most useful foundations for that dialogue and for this change? We now have WTO, we have TPP, we have RCEP. What is your view?
It seems to me that all of this is happening in front of the WTO. So the first thing we have to say is the WTO appears to be the right mechanism when things are doing fine, and you can present your complaints and your cases, and a year and a half later you have an answer. Today, the WTO seems very feeble, very incapable of carrying out its role, and I think one reason is there isn't really authority, legal authority over governments, or at least they haven't proven that. But all of this is happening right now where the world trading system seems to be crumbling. It's happening in front of the WTO, and I don't hear enough from the WTO. I think that what makes the WTO, what made it important was that everyone wanted more trade. The world wanted more trade. What happens in a world like today where trade is being challenged? So I don't believe that the WTO is the solution. I think the solution is going to be, unfortunately, country by country. I think some countries will say, well, since the U.S. appears to be going protectionist, we will as well. We were talking a little while ago, there'll be other countries who will say, well, since the U.S. is going that way, we're going to take advantage and go the other way. So I do see the world being split between those who are protectionist, those who aren't, those who are breaking WTO rules, and regrettably, I don't see what the WTO can do or is doing to exert at least some a point of view as to what's happening. In the U.S., we argue, are we in a war? Is there a battle? Or every war starts with a battle, and I think we are in a battle. And after every war, there is a shakeout of things. There is a new order. There is a new system. And I would not be surprised to see something of that nature. For example, a framework for the U.S. and China to coexist in spite of the fact that they have different economic systems. But I do believe that we are at a breaking point where I don't believe the future institutions will look the way they look today.
That's very interesting thoughts. 前部长，我可不可以
So, Minister Chen, can I bring you into this conversation? Because today's time is very interesting. Over the past 2 days, China and U.S. have made their voices heard. And in today's Boao Forum, it's the first time for us to have such high-level commerce representatives from China and U.S. How do you look at this issue? So Trump has challenged the global trading system. So how shall we improve such platform and create a better platform? We have WTO, TPP, RCEP. What's your take? Now, China-U.S. trading frictions have become a hot topic. Some may turn it as a trade war. And Mr. Guterres mentions that the WTO is at a weakling position. It is because it's weaker right now, therefore we need to provide more protection. For instance, several days ago, Beijing is suffering from a cold front. And then there is heavy snow in Beijing. So now the global economy is like in a cold winter. And if we can contribute our part and contribute our branch to the fire, we can make the flame mightier. So if we all play a part in dismantling the building may fall apart. After the Second World War, the multilateralism has played a big role in promoting globalization. We used to resort to war and arm to expand our market and territory. And now we are in an era defined by rules and law. And this is a major step forward for human society. We should never go back. And we need to contribute our branch to the mighty flame of the world economy and to contribute our brick to the grand building of multilateralism. And we should not only think about ourselves, we should not say something like American first or China first or India first. Otherwise, we may go back to before the Second World War. Before the Second World War, trade protectionism prevailed, and there was this significant chaos in the world. Any responsible country or any responsible or conscientious leader need to fight against trade protectionism. China's stance is very clear. We don't want to fight the trade war, but we are not afraid of it. Fighting the trade war is not only about protecting the interest of Chinese people, but also safeguarding the multilateralism and existing free trade system. WTO and regional economic integration, of course, have their own share of problems. So it's important that we sit down and have a dialogue on solving this issue. We can always find an answer and solution. That's my point.
Jenny, can I come to you for this?
Yes. Look, it's extremely important that this doesn't become just about the United States and China. As a small economy that trades with the world, by the way, we are one of the most open markets in the world. We tried protectionism in the 70s and 80s and very nearly destroyed ourselves. I don't have time to explain to you how counterproductive and destructive protectionism is, both short and medium term. It is a fool's path, in my opinion, and I'll leave it there. But I do want to raise this question of how have we got to a point where this appears to be a conversation about US and China, and we are hardly having regard for the implications as it flows through to the global economies. I mean, markets are very unsettled today. And small people get hurt. If you protect It is the small people when prices go up and inflation becomes the result of protecting. It hurts ordinary citizens and small and medium-sized businesses and their confidence to continue. And you then start eroding the capability of these economic tools. So coming back, I can remember a tension point in the late 90s when, in fact, China was seeking to join the WTO. And it was a conversation about China and the US. And the only way through these things is to find means for people to sit down and speak about it. And my observation on this event, and I'm not a specialist, I'm simply a former leader from a small country that has a great interest in free trade, we shouldn't muddle the fact that it's the WTO's fault. I mean, we can talk about whether the WTO is up to the game, but I think that if there are matters between nations, particularly when we're talking about integration and tolerance and the ways in which you interact, you need to also be willing as leaders to find ways to resolve matters that are outstanding. If you look at the most significant integrated economies, they do have mechanisms that they don't rely on the WTO to regularly meet and put issues on the table and air them and resolve them. The WTO is there as the last resort, where if you cannot make progress and you think there is a case, that you have a chance to deal with it. Personally, I do think the WTO is in some trouble. And for those of you who are leading companies, you know yourselves, I chair companies, the need to be agile in a fast-moving world as opposed to institutionally moribund is critical. And I think the challenge for the WTO is whether it's migrating its approach to its task, both as the policeman, but also raising its voice and saying, let's get to these points of crisis, whether they are taking that leadership role appropriately as opposed to sheltering behind what is now a many-decade-old institution. And I would argue that we need to bring the freshness of the breezes in business about agile movements and flexibility into some of our institutions, or they will fail. G20 is a very useful tool. I think it's a very balanced tool globally, and I would hope that some of the leaders of the G20 could facilitate this. Even small economies like ours have confidence that that group are far more balanced than the Eurocentric groups. And I have one last completely different point. I don't know if it's being a female leader, but do you know the elevated language around war is completely inappropriate here. And it is giving this conflict a status it doesn't deserve. There is a deep disagreement here, and there are high stakes. But I think we should be very cautious before we use the language of war, insofar as the history of that is well known. And it almost invites people to brinkmanship that I don't think is warranted in this case. I think intelligent engagement in a world where the population is so much greater, we are sharing and have to learn to share a more compressed space with far more going on. This is a challenge of our times rather than a war. And I personally, if I had the power, would say stop using that, because it is masking a much bigger challenge of a population that's 3 times larger than when I was born, an economy that's globally far larger than when I was born. I'm personally highly optimistic, if we simply sort this out and get on with it, that this doesn't have to be a catastrophe. But we mustn't use the language of yesterday to try and solve the problems of tomorrow.
That's a very important note. Thank you very much for that. I will come back to that. But before I do that, can I go back to the original question and ask Sawada-san and Professor Zhao to comment on the current global trading system, dysfunctional, not war, the global trading tensions?
So I agree, Jenny, that we should call it trade tension or something like that. And also, I agree to Carlos and Jenny again. WTO has been facing some binding constraint right now. But at the same time, we should reaffirm what Mr. Chen said. Since the end of World War II, global economy has been benefiting from the free and liberal world trading system. And Asia is one of the most benefited regions around the globe. Having said this, I would think WTO global free trading system, we can take this as an ultimate goal or ultimate target we need to meet in the future. And because global free trade cannot achieve overnight, we need we need to take some route, and there are going to be multiple routes. And seeing this TPP 11 or Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement TPP signed last month in Peru, I think that's the major progress. And now major member countries should work on their domestic process. Another, ASEAN-led RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That's another really a mega, FTA covering 30% of global GDP and more than 2 billion people involved in this ASEAN-led RCEP. RCEP is kind of ASEAN plus 3 consolidated together to make it more, bigger free trade area. So seeing this, progress of different routes, I think these are major stepping stones towards the WTO. And again, we have to reaffirm the importance of free global trade, and we are, in a sense, we are still on the right track, although there are some turbulence to this process.
Thank you, Professor Zhao.
Well, Ms. Shipley, you mentioned the history of the trade system. I think right now we are just repeating the history. And you said that you don't like to use the word war, but actually WTO was established after we learned the lessons from the first 2 world wars, that we should never fight the trade wars and we should never establish trade tariffs in the future. That is why we started our efforts to promote free trade. From GATT to WTO. Those were our initial efforts. But now I think WTO is encountering some challenges. The challenges come from the groups that are toward protectionism. Everyone wants to protect him or herself. But why? I think it's because of the technology development. Since the Industrial Revolution, people have been working to adapt to the revolutions, to the technology developments. Technology developments are not evil. We cannot blame technologies. So people found a scapegoat for that, which is trade. The trade deficits and imbalances, they are just symptoms. Behind those are actually the integrated global system. However, if we only look at the global system from one perspective, you cannot see the whole picture. So if I were to understand where Mr. Trump was coming from, I think I want to understand him as a classic trade protectionist who is sincere about protecting the American people. However, if we or Mr. Trump removed all of the manufacturing plants back to the USA, will the labor market in the US adapt to that? At that time, there will be no job created because the robots will be used in the plants for now. So I think for WTO and the free trade system, we want to bring or create an optimal resource allocation in the world. And me, as an international trade scholar, I feel that I'm saddened by the policies that we are seeing right now in the countries. Because economists, we all see the benefits of free trade, but the policies are going in the other direction. So I'm saddened by the fact. I talked with my US colleagues as well. they said that they were also frustrated because the president would not listen to them and the policy makers wouldn't listen to them. I think that those policies just cannot explain themselves logically. Of course, I understand some of those policies may came from an election perspective or purpose, but I'm truly saddened by that. A multilateral free trade system like RCEP and TPP, they are all efforts and initiatives established to promote free trade in the region. I think that shows that we are not just standing empty-handed. I'm sure that we all need to follow some basic logic. If we defy the basic economic logic, we will have to come back and redo it all over again. And I'm confident that we will go back to the right trajectory.
I just wanted to add, I think it's almost as if though protectionism is a symptom of populism. And I wish we had a world populism organization to keep an eye on people who are going down that road, because it's been very easy for President Trump to say, you may not be achieving salary increases like you want. We know that you've been left behind, but it's not your fault. It is the fault of trade. And that's where the problems start. That's where the problems have always started. And it's a shame because the world was moving in a certain direction. And I think it continues to have that momentum. We're just going to have a lot of pieces to pick up and put back together after this whole thing is over. But for me, populism has been what's driven this tension.
Can I pick up on 前部长您想说
I really agree with what Carlos Goodman just said. Because populism and protectionism, they have found a scapegoat, trade. In the process of globalization, I think no one can turn it back, because that is the direction of human progress. And when we are looking into the policies that we are making, the mistakes that we're probably making, there is possibly a mistake that we are looking for the wrong reason or the causes. Since the Second World War, the world GDP tripled and the world trade grew by 7 or 8 times. Investment grew by a dozen times, and the population out of poverty, a lot of population out of poverty. So a lot of benefits, obvious ones, of globalization. Of course, globalization also created issues such as imbalances and gaps between developed nations and developing ones. Developed countries, they have got the most benefits out of globalization. Emerging countries like China, India, and Brazil, we are also benefiting from it, but not as much. And some small-sized emerging countries, developing countries, they have not benefited from globalization because they were late to hop on the train. Within each nation, there is also income gaps. I saw a lot of reports on U.S. income gaps, like from Professor Krugman, and also from World Bank reports, 50% of the income, or 50% of the households in the U.S., their income did not change for the past 30 years. But the wealthiest part, their income tripled, especially those Wall Street elites and the technology elites in Silicon Valley. Of course, that was not caused by trade, but someone may blame it for trade because a lot of jobs were removed to other countries. But as a nation, the U.S. benefited a lot, but those benefits was not allocated equally to different groups of people in the U.S. So I think this leads to populist or populism belief of anti-globalization in the U.S. This also was caused by the misleading propaganda or promotion of the leadership of the government. So for our next step, we must have to go deep to find the real cause instead of just blaming everything on trade. This is what I want to say. Thank you.
Carlos, can I come back to you? You mentioned the rising populism, and Professor Zhao also talks about the upcoming midterm. So, I mean, you worked in the government before. Some people say what Trump is doing right now is just a negotiation tactics where he sort of comes in and try to disrupt the entire current status quo, and then it's a lot easier to have a lot of give and takes. Or the upcoming midterm election could be another reason. So do you think it's possible that, also related to what Jenny was saying earlier, that if we have a very intelligent engagement, then it's not going to be a war. Maybe this trade tension is going to disappear very soon. Do you think that there is a likelihood for a trade deal coming up soon? And if so, what would that trade deal look like?
Well, coming up soon would have to be within the next 2 to 4 months, because that's the time that the U.S. has to implement the 301 mechanism. They have a comment period, and then they'll first announce the tariffs and then have a comment period. I doubt very much that that we can negotiate a trade deal between China and the U.S. in 2 months. I doubt very much we can do it in 4 months. I also worry, and this is a speculation on my part, that there are people around the President Trump, who want him to take action. That a negotiated deal in 3 weeks means we didn't try hard enough. That we will never get to the other side of this until we have a fight and then we make up. The problem is that there is no, at least I don't see a strategy. I see tactics. I see almost like a poker game. I see you're 50 and I'll raise you 100. And, you know, a lot of moves and almost like, you know, a game of hockey where everything is going depending on where the cup goes, but there isn't a strategy, there isn't an idea of what do we want the world to look like in terms of commerce, and how do we get there. That for me is seriously lacking, and I think it's a debate for whether it's G20, whether it's the UN, whether it's countries by countries, but we need to understand where we're going. And right now we're sort of at a standstill and just you know, picking fights.
Thank you, Jenny.
I just want to say that I didn't answer your question on the elections. The issue here is going to be, yes, you help your base, or you appeal to your base by being tough on other countries. But if that affects the economy by the time the elections come, then appealing to the base will work against the president. And I think all of this has to do with timing, what it means for people. We saw the agriculture sector rise up in complaint against the NAFTA negotiations. So NAFTA will probably survive because the constituents have said this is not good for us. I don't know if there's enough time for constituents to stand up before the midterm elections. So I believe that the people around the president are saying a trade fight is a good thing politically, and then some actually believe that it's a good thing economically. And I still don't understand how they get to that conclusion, but I think that's what's happening today in the U.S.
Quickly on that point, the response from China, many believe is very sophisticated and can be useful because part of what it's doing is to go after the very powerful lobbies such as soybeans or aircrafts, right? And also it goes into key political states such as Wisconsin or Kentucky. So do you think these responses would be able to give Trump or the people around him some more pressures or hopefully wake them up to some senses?
Well, that's the big question. You know, soy, for example, of the $50 billion that China said would put tariffs on, between 12 and 14 is soy. So that's part of the equation. The thing that we have to understand too is that it's easy populism to criticize China. So in that regard, politically speaking, the president may get some support for that. But it's come to the point now where people want to hold hearings on trade, people want to hold hearings on what's happening with China, people want to hold hearings on NAFTA. So the Congress is beginning to worry about where we are going. So there's a lot that can happen between now and November, but a lot can go wrong that can affect the midterms.
A bit too difficult to read. Thank you for that. Jenny, I understand that New Zealand had entered trade disputes with U.S. before and won. So what did you do?
What did you do wrong?
Look, we're a small country, and one of the reasons I do support the WTO is that certainly while I was in office, we did have a dispute around lamb. And we tried negotiation and rational discussions around timing and how we could progress. And it didn't work, so we took it to the WTO and we won that case. What was interesting afterward was that the US did take it seriously, and so there's that pre-negotiation. If it fails, you go to the WTO. If you're lucky enough to win, as we did, there's still another negotiation. And so it was then finding an agreement as to how those tariffs would be reduced over time. But to the credit of the US at that time, that did happen. And so our confidence in it, albeit that it does take a year and a half as opposed to 6 weeks. And that is an issue for the WTO. They have to think about their mechanisms. But yes, it worked for us.
You mentioned this intelligent engagement earlier. So while Carlos isn't most optimistic, are you optimistic that we may be able to achieve some sort of trade deal? And if so, what would that look like?
Look, I don't want to speculate on how this will end between the United States and China. I think perhaps, I personally am looking forward to the President's speech tomorrow. Perhaps it will illuminate that slightly as to what that approach will take. But what I think is clear is that while this is going on, and it's been going on for some time, there have been other trends. And somebody mentioned TPP and RCEP and so on, and the value of those. If large economies think they can live simply by trading within their 260 or 300 million people and don't need everyone else, well, that's fine. I think you do see trends, and TPP was an absolute response to that. I can tell you that when the Doha round kept stalling in the late 90s, I can recall a conversation with Goh Chok Tong and I, and it was at APEC in 1999, running up to that. we were deeply frustrated that we could not seem to get, even through the APEC mechanism, any momentum. And both Singapore and New Zealand, as you know, are open economies, and we felt that if we gave a signal and set up a trade agreement, and it was called the P2, and said if other people want to meet the standard, they can join. So we weren't negotiating bilateral, or we were simply setting a standard and saying, let's try and click folk on. And so the P2 went to P3 with Chile, and then P4, and then TPP emerged, and you know the rest of the history. It will be interesting to see whether that, which is a high-quality trade agreement, it's most recently been agreed and it's been legislated in the respective economies, and if that does go as well as I think the experience of others of us who've had either bilateral free trade agreements and seen the success of those, then these economies that choose to meet that standard and network and collaborate with open markets will enjoy that success. New Zealand's free trade agreement with China, which was the first that China entered into, has been a huge success for both economies. And I think a lot of people thought it was only about us, but actually I think both parties and both our Prime Minister and the President have talked about it moving from 20 billion to 30 billion in a very short period of time. And so my point here is if you get like-minded people who can sit down and agree, and we are in the process of reviewing and refreshing that FTA 10 years on, so that agile approach that things do change, is it time for further discussion, and we have found that our participants are open to that. That seems to be serving New Zealand well. I think you will see if the large economies or regions choose to act and close in and protect themselves, that there will still be certain players who will take the alternative route. And certainly from a small country's point of view, we hope that it will be all of us rather than select, because we leave people behind. I mean, New Zealand's done well through free trade agreements, but I lament the fact that there are economies close to our own where they are not included in FTAs and they are not easily able to contemplate a Doha round. And there is a gap in that it holds people back rather than advances them. So we do have to find a way to, maybe the RCEP will be an example where we'll bring a like-minded group of economies that are not yet at WTO standard and bring them together, and through collaboration and sharing at least make some progress through that complementarity that agreements achieve. Although for my part I have some anxiety that it will be a lesser standard permanently. So I think personally it's a very good starting point as long as its ambition is, as people learn to frame and comply and open up and adjust, that it has very good prospects.
Thank you, Prime Minister Shipley. Before I move away from trade, I want to have one last question. You mentioned other countries, smaller countries. So, I mean, a trade war, trade tensions, if it were to happen between the U.S. and China, it's not just U.S. and China that will get hurt, but for other Asian economies as well, given how integrated and the intra-trade within Asia. So if this trade tension escalate, what other economies within Asia do you believe would get hit most?
I would say most economies that China does business with. To the extent that the cost of doing business in China goes up and the cost of inputs goes up. Because it's not just U.S. and China, but it's U.S. ships goods to China that are then manufactured and shipped to other countries in Asia. That would be impacted. There are some countries who will see benefits. So if the U.S. Can't export soy to China, Argentina and Brazil will. But generally speaking, I would say a problem between U.S. and China would impact the global economy. And for those who have a problem with the rise of China, we'll see what problem they have if China ever grows at 3% instead of 6.5%. That's a problem.
Thank you. 前部长.
Yes, I quite agree with Mr. Gutierrez. Indeed, the trade friction between China and U.S., if it were to happen, there's no beneficiary. On the one hand, the global supply chain will be broken. China exports to America, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asian countries also export to China, and this supply chain will be broken. Second, it will disrupt the free trade order and multilateral trade mechanism. It will present a major challenge. And such order that create an enabling environment will be damaged. And third, Carlos mentioned that Brazil, if we do not import soil from America, we might import from Brazil and Argentina. This is in the short term, but in the long term, I think no country can benefit. Thank you.
As Mr. Chen mentioned, Asian economies are so much interconnected, not only within Asia but also outside of Asia. So Chinese economic slowdown will generate negative spillover to other Asian countries. Although current trade policy changes being discussed, we don't know what's the likely consequences. But we did some analysis a couple of years ago, Asian Development Bank. 1 percentage point decline in Chinese economy will slow down Asian economic growth by 0.3%. So, again, it's not clear yet what's the likely consequences of the current policy changes, but definitely, we should reaffirm again the importance of keeping the free trade and preserving the prosperity through open, cross-border goods and services transactions.
Thank you. So let's move back to Asia economic integration overall. So I want to ask about your views on Belt and Road Initiative. So how do you see Belt and Road Initiative can contribute to a better and closer integrated Asia economy? Is it trade, facilitations, or liberalization? Is it investment, or is it financial integration, or anything else?
It's a massive infrastructure project. I believe it's the largest in the world. So on one hand, there is stimulating economies through the infrastructure. But it is a way of tying together not just Asia, but Asia and Europe. And I think what's going to really matter is the political will of every country to actually be committed to this. I say that out of experience, and I'll go back to North America for 1 second. In 2006, there was an attempt to do a free trade area of the Americas and build roads going all the way down Canada, Argentina, and there wasn't political will in the U.S. and in some countries around the region. My sense is that in Asia, there is more uniformity, that trade is important, that trade is good, that is the way you grow. It's very rare that all, I think it's 31 countries in the Americas will agree to that. But I think Belt and Road is a tremendous initiative. I think it shows leadership, confidence, and confidence in the future. And I think that's what makes it so impressive. It's breathtaking. It's trillions of dollars.
Confidence into the future. Anyone else?
The Belt and Road Initiative once proposed, was welcomed and supported by many nations. And we have signed agreements with over 80 nations and multilateral organizations. Over 100 nations and global organizations are now a part of Belt and Road Initiative. I think our efforts under this initiative will play three roles in Asian economic integration. The first one is infrastructure, integrated and connected infrastructure. We established the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. We cooperate with Asian Development Bank on many projects. Right now, we have invested on 24 large-scale projects, great ones. I read one of the ADB reports that in the next 10 years of Asia, there is a need of 800 billion RMB. I'm sorry, 80 million US dollars of investment in infrastructure. But now, from all of those banks, our investment is only like 30 billion. So there is a huge gap. And China is only making up for a small part of it. In this process, we will need to encourage investment from all of the countries under this initiative. For infrastructure development, it generates a scale benefit. Because if the railroads and roads are not connected, then we will have very limited effects. But if they are connected, we will have scale benefits. And why are they called infrastructure? They are the foundations for economic development. They have a spillover effect. So investing in infrastructure will play an extremely important role in Asia economic development. And investing in infrastructure also creates jobs and creates demands for example, steel and cement. And they promote economic development as well. So the first role, I think, is to build connected and integrated infrastructure. The second role of this initiative is a soft connection in policy and government regulation levels. It can benefit the countries and organizations of this initiative in terms of interfacing. We can generate multilateral or mutually agreed rules and codes which will help improve our communication. Not long ago, we launched an initiative of promoting communication for Belt and Road Initiative. So this also helps our soft connection among all governments and organizations. The third role, I think, is the most important one, is that under this protectionism or unilateralism trend in the world, the Belt and Road Initiative is a representative of a multilateral negotiation and the spirit of the Silk Road, cooperation, inclusion, learning from each other, and working with each other. A team spirit, I want to say it. So we want to build the common society for all human beings because we all live in planet Earth. And our economies are connected with each other. No economy can develop on its own. So this initiative is really a response to this protectionist trend. And I think this spirit will cheer up all of the nations in Asia for future economic development and integration. And this initiative will also support the free trade development in the future.
Mr. Gutierrez has to leave us a bit earlier, so before you go, can you give us a quick takeaway message of where do you think, when we talk a lot about the global trading system and Asian economic integration, where do you see this trade situation going, and what's your advice?
Well, as my partner, co-chairman Madeleine Albright says, I'm an optimist, but I worry a lot. So what I worry about is that we are at the beginning of a fight. And in the short term, positions have been taken where it doesn't seem feasible that this fight can be resolved in the short term. But I think we have to start thinking about what happens after the fight. That is the big strategic question for the world. Where do we want to be? How did we get here? How can we avoid this? But the fight is going to happen, and maybe we'll look back and say, it was necessary. I don't know. But I think we need to be talking about what happens after, because there's not going to be a winner. This isn't like a physical war. No one's going to win. I read an article the other day that said the best way to win a trade war is to not have one. So once we agree to that, then where do we go from here?
Thank you very much, Mr. Gutierrez. I'll leave you to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh.
I think nobody's going to come up and pick you up, so thank you for that. All right. Sorry, Sawada-san, you were going to say.
Yes, as Carlos just said, I think continuing a free trade is very important to, keep Asian growth momentum going. And in order to do that, as a foundation, we need infrastructure investment, right type infrastructure investment in transport sector, energy, and ICT, information and communication technology sectors. And in that respect, ADB really acknowledge and appreciate Belt and Road Initiative. And we really are fully aware and share the view of Belt and Road Initiative to facilitate connectivity between Asia and Europe so that both regions can continue prosperity. And indeed, ADB has been, actually ADB Charter has its mandate, regional cooperation integration. We need to do and promote regional cooperation integration. And since 1992, ADB has been supporting Greater Mekong Sub-Region program, which involves not only Southeast Asian countries along the Mekong River, but also Chinese Yunnan province and Guangxi province. Another sub-regional program ADB has been supporting is a CAREC initiative or CAREC program in Central Asia. Actually, I think BIR is, in a sense, quite similar to this ADB-supported regional cooperation integration initiative at greater scale. So in that respect, I really ADB really share its vision to improve intra-regional connectivity. Having this said, as Mr. Chang mentioned, we did the infrastructure investment needs estimate last year, and according to our analysis, 1.7 trillion in US dollar term, 1.7 trillion US dollars physical investment in infrastructure needed in next up until 2025 Sustainable Development Goal year 2025. 1.7 trillion US dollars per year. That's a big chunk of money. And according to, again, our analysis, probably 400 billion or 500 billion unmet demand needs exist in Asia. So unless we, somehow fill in this 500 billion additional infrastructure investment, we cannot continue growth momentum of Asia, poverty reduction trend, and also we cannot really achieve global climate goals. So this is very important to fill in. And MDBs, multilateral development bank like ADB and World Bank, current scale of funding is only 2.5% of 1.7 trillion US dollars. So direct financeability or loan scale of MDBs are quite limited. Of course, we are engaging to improve our leverage and provision of guarantees. Not only, as Mr. Chan said, not only we providing physical infrastructure financing, but also we provide lots of soft support to build up an ecosystem of infrastructure investment. But this remaining gap is really huge. So in that respect, as Mr. Chen also mentioned, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and ADB has been already starting co-financing projects. 4 projects, transport project in Pakistan, and energy project in Bangladesh, another transport project in Georgia, and now India energy project. So I think this is very important to collaborate, ADB and AIB, collaborate together to at least partially fill in this unmet demand.
Thank you, Suwada-san. We have time for one very quick question. There we go. This lady in gray. If you could keep it really brief, please. And who are you addressing the question to?
Just from Phoenix Weekly, it's a very quick question. So someone saying that maybe the trade war is, I cannot be quick. So someone's saying that trade war is a war, but someone's saying this maybe could be a win-win situation for both countries, to deepen maybe the opening up policy of China. So what do you think about it?
Anyone would like to comment on that? No.
Well, my take is that if you put these two together, I think they are just a coincidence. It's not like it's a causal relationship. Opening up of China this year marks the 40th anniversary of China's opening up policy. So in the past 40 years, we always had this clear strategy of opening up, and we implement this gradually. So every corner of the world, they are interested in China's opening up strategy. Because a lot of countries, they tried to open up to the world, but China made it. We succeeded in the past 40 years, and we are confident to go on. And people are looking forward to that, to what China will be able to achieve in the future. So I guess right now, China has an option. In the 1970s, China's population accounts for 22% of the world. But in terms of GDP, China only accounted for 2% of the world at that time. So China was an extremely poor country at that time. But now, China accounts for 15% of the world GDP. And population-wise, we account for 18%. So we still need to catch up. And that's why we need to deepen our reform and hope that our population and our fortune can account for an equal ratio in the world.
And this will be a process for human civilization. If a minority of people owns the majority of the wealth, the world would be unfair. And now, opening up technology advancement make it possible. And getting high profit out of technology dominance and monopoly is not the good way forward. We need to encourage competition and innovation. Without innovation, we could only use simple lights. Of course, I can protect the patent for 200 years of the simple lights, and we would never have such a civilization. Therefore, we need competition and innovation. So this breakdown session is about to close.
Can I ask each of you to give 1 minute, okay, maximum 1 minute, of your takeaway or the message that you want everyone in the room to take away? What is your thoughts of the current trade situation, and what is your suggestion? 1 minute, please.
So I think, again, every country should preserve free trade, and Asia's prosperity has been and will be based on free trade and free investment. So I think we should reaffirm this fundamental, logic. And then, although we are all aware of recent developments in trade policy changes, we need to watch it closely. And actually, ADB, we will release our flagship publication, Asian Development Outlook, 2 days later, Wednesday morning in Hong Kong. So, and that Asian Development Outlook this year will have a small section quantifying likely consequences of trade policy. And also, we have a thematic chapter on impact of new technology on Asian jobs, and which is, I think, a very important issue we didn't really cover during this session.
Thank you, Sawada-san. Thank you. 钱部长。
I want to say that globalization is an irreversible historic process. Despite the many problems we're having right now, 2 things remain unchanged. The first is the spirit of free trade. Second is multilateralism. We still need to work together to safeguard the golden opportunity of development and create the future opportunities of growth so that the new type of globalization will be more inclusive and more fairer. We will never leave one country behind and work together to promote the healthy development of globalization.
We're so connected that we have to accept that inclusion and sharing is part of the future. We're at a pivotal moment. And I think it's true to say that there are things that both China and the US need to address in this current dispute. And you would hope that they will find a way to put those on the table and air them, because that's what every relationship is like. From time to time it flares. The only way you find your way through is to work constructively. I hope we don't finish up head to head. I hope people will find a way to collaborate. My personal aspiration would be that the leaders of the G20 literally pick the phone up and agree that they will meet or air, because everyone is hit by this. And it's very important we don't stand back like paralyzed people, but rather think about what would you do in your business circumstance, what would you do in your personal circumstance. You wouldn't wait for a diplomatic solution that is slow. You would find a way to take action. So for me, if the G20 leaders are listening, pick the phone up and find a neutral place to either meet or a way to speak, and share this question of unintended consequences, because the unintended consequences of a serious trade conflict are far greater than what we're discussing right now.
Thank you, Jenny. And finally, Professor Zhao.
So we have to be the staunch supporter of free trade and continue to open up